Hello, kids. Mr. B here. It is time for us to cover, honestly and truthfully, one of my favorite things to look at because parts of the water cycle are going on around us all the time. But, throughout the day, in the classroom, outside the classroom, when you take a shower and you fog up the mirror, water cycle is going on nonstop. And it really is kind of neat to get a little bit more of an understanding of the water cycle so that when you see these things, you start to recognize them for what they are. And you can teach other people about it and harass them about the water cycle so that they yell at you the way that my wife yells at me on a weekend when she says, "It's the weekend, I don't want to hear anything about science." And then I tell her anyway. So here we go. Water cycle. The continuous movement of water between the Earth's surface and the air, where it changes from liquid to gas to liquid, and sometimes it hits the solid in there as well. And we'll get to that. It's kind of one of those chicken and egg kind of questions, like which came first. Where do you start in the water cycle? It really doesn't matter where you start, but we're going to start right here in this big puddle of water. This is water in its liquid state. Water can be a solid, it can be a liquid, or it can be a gas. If it rained and the puddles just stayed there, it would not be a puddle long. It soon would start to grow into a giant puddle, and then eventually we'd all be underwater. But that doesn't happen. It rained last night. It was raining a little bit this morning. And when I went outside for recess with my students today, at least on the playground, the hardtop, the puddles were gone. What could make a puddle, and I put into quotation marks, disappear? Now, when we're talking about water disappearing, this is not some trick that Penn and Teller might pull up on the stage. Although I'm sure they could come up with something along the lines of that. But that's really not what's going on. And I think a lot of it has to go back to the fact that we just talked about that water can exist in three different states: solid, liquid, or gas. When the sun shines on that puddle, it causes the water to heat up. Once the water reaches a certain point, it turns from a liquid, which we can see, into a gas or water vapor, which we cannot see. In the classroom right now, there is water vapor coming out of everyone's mouth that is talking or just mouth breathing. Water vapor. It is everywhere. It is outside of the car. It is inside of the car. Water is in its gas form. When water turns from liquid to gas, we call it evaporation. Now, this is very important. Water is turning from a liquid to a gas or a vapor. We call it evaporation. We could call it evaporation, although that's not the way to pronounce it. But if you call it evaporation to help you remember that it's a water vapor and vapor is a gas, then that's fine. Evaporation. Once again, here we have the sun as the major source of energy. We all know that in food chains, the sun is the major source of energy. It gives energy to the plants, which then in turn give energy to the herbivores, which then in turn give energy to the carnivores, and so forth. But in this instance, the sun is the major source of energy in the water cycle. You probably will see that again at some point. The sun is the major source of energy in the water cycle. It's what drives the entire water cycle process to continue to move on. Now, we have all this water vapor, and when water gets warm enough, it turns into a gas, and that gas doesn't just sit there and hover above the parking lot where that puddle was. It rises up into the atmosphere. And something that we will get to later, but that you kind of need to know now, the higher I go in the atmosphere, to an extent, until we change this later on, but when we get up into certain layers of the atmosphere, it gets colder. As water vapor is heated up, as water is heated up, it turns into a vapor. However, when that vapor is cooled off enough, it turns back into tiny droplets of water. That happens pretty high in our atmosphere. Not nearly as high as our atmosphere goes, but pretty high in the atmosphere. And we call, what is this slide? I've never seen this slide before. Did I make this? I don't even remember making this slide, kids. Sorry, this one must be new. No wonder it said Nearpod new when I opened it. Now I guess I need to get the new notes for this. Anyway, all right. So you've probably seen steam rising from a hot road during the summertime. This is evaporation. It's important to know that once water evaporates and turns into a gas, it rises into the air. We just talked about that. It keeps going until a certain point. Liquid water, heated by the sun, evaporates, turns into a gas or a vapor, and it rises up into the atmosphere. Once that water vapor reaches that certain point in the atmosphere where the temperature has cooled it off enough to turn back into water droplets, we have something called condensation. Now, I know that I said that the water cycle is happening all around us. If you get into a super hot shower, the shower is just steaming hot, you might see steam all around the bathroom. You're sort of seeing water vapor at that point, sort of. I mean, if you get really close to it, it's really just tiny drops of water. But when the water is super hot and this bathroom's starting to get foggy, there is one place where you can see this process called condensation, where the gas turns into water droplets, and that's going to be on the mirrors in the bathroom. If you've ever gotten out and seen those little teeny tiny drops or even big drops of water on the mirrors in your bathroom, that is condensation. Another place condensation happens. I have told you that water vapor is always present in the air, and it is. If you have ever taken a cold can of Pepsi or Cheerwine or Coke outside on a hot summer day, and you sit the can down, and you come back about 2 minutes later, and it looks like the can is sweating. The can is not sweating. There is no water leaking through the can. The water vapor that is actually in the air gets close to the can. The can is cold. It cools that water vapor off and turns it back into water droplets, which then attach to your can. Condensation. Now, you are going to hear me say this, and from now on, from the rest of the year, and even if my juniors and seniors walk into the room, I would expect them to be able to repeat this. If I say condensation, you are going to say is cloud formation. It is a little tiny rhyme that will help us remember this. Condensation is cloud formation. Condensation is cloud formation. How do the clouds form in the sky? That water vapor that we have from the sun heating up that puddle rises up into the air. Once it gets to a certain layer of the atmosphere and it is cooled off, it turns into teeny tiny water droplets. Those water droplets also have particles of dust and other things attached to them, and they all hover in a big giant group called clouds. It would probably shock you and scare you to know that the clouds, quote unquote, floating above your head, and they are floating, weigh millions of pounds, because they are nothing but tiny water droplets floating all together in one space. It's pretty amazing to see how the way clouds work. If you're able to go outside, and this is a great time of year when it's really, really foggy. Take a flashlight, not one of those weak flashlights. Get your dad's strong flashlight, with his permission, of course. Go outside and shine that light straight up. If you look into the beam of light, you're going to see teeny tiny little pellets of water floating right by you. They are so small that they are able to float like that because they're not being pulled down very quickly by gravity, because they are so small and so lightweight. That you are essentially, if you can see fog, you are in a low-lying stratus cloud, which we will get to when we start to study weather, and it's important to understand that. Condensation is cloud formation. Now, just like that mirror in your bathroom, at first it's teeny tiny little water droplets, and the longer you take a shower, more and more water starts to adhere to that mirror because it is cold, and those water droplets start to get very big. Well, they don't just hang out giant water droplets at the top of the mirror. What happens? Eventually, they fall down the mirror. Well, that has to be the logical process that happens right after condensation. Again, here's a picture of that mirror. You notice these teeny tiny little drops of water, but some of these water droplets start to get even larger. Eventually, these giant water drops, which is condensation, are going to, it's like the teeny tiny ones start to kind of form together, and they start forming bigger and bigger water droplets. Once those water droplets get too large, they don't hang out up here on the mirror anymore. They run down the mirror. A very similar process happens when they're in the cloud. A teeny tiny little water droplet floats by, and it bumps into another one, and they become a little bit of a bigger water droplet. Then that water droplet bumps into 3 or 4 more water droplets, and it starts to eventually get into a very large water droplet that is no longer able to just float around in the cloud. It is going to fall to the ground. And we go from evaporation to condensation to precipitation. Here's that word some people were asking questions about in class the other day. Precipitation. Water doesn't just want to sit there and collect. It evaporates, right? And we want that to happen. We don't want it to just sit there. We also don't want water to just condensate. We kind of need it to come back, right? If the sun evaporated everything and that was all it did, we would all be dead very, very soon because the water would be gone from Earth in not a lot of time. Luckily, when it goes up, it evaporates, it condensates, because condensation is cloud formation, and those teeny tiny water droplets start to bump into each other, become bigger. Eventually they get too big and they fall back to Earth. Now, there is 4 main types of precipitation, okay? And it depends on the weather that we're having. Rain, sleet, snow, and hail are 4 types of water that can fall back to the Earth. And we'll get into the different types of precipitation soon. Probably not now. We'll get into that when we're studying weather, when we can dig a little bit deeper into that. But right now, we're really wanting to just really nail down what the water cycle is all about. And that would be precipitation. When those teeny tiny water droplets from condensation have gotten too large and they decide to return to Earth, it is called precipitation. 4 main types: rain, sleet, snow, and hail. Obviously here, right? If it's raining, it's above freezing. If it's here or here, it is below freezing. Hail is a very weird thing. It can be very warm down here where we are, but extremely cold up in the clouds. And we'll get to how hail forms later. But hail forms and mostly falls during pretty bad storms, like very intense thunderstorms. But for right now, just know that rain, sleet, snow, and hail are our 4 main types of precipitation. I'm probably not going to get into the other types of precipitation with you this year. If you want to learn some of those on your own, you're welcome to do that. If you know these 4 for me, you are going to be fine. So precipitation. So we have that puddle sitting on the ground, and we know that the sun will cause evaporation. But there is one more way that water can get into the atmosphere. And it is a process that we have mentioned before. If I go outside and run 12 laps around the school in the middle of August, I'm going to start sweating because the sun makes me hot, moving makes me warm, and my body releases sweat so that I can cool myself off, because water helps cool you off. Now, this is extremely important to understand. Plants go through something very similar. They go through a process called transpiration. It's kind of like perspiration, like we do, like sweating. Transpiration is when moisture moves through a plant, through its leaves, and when those water is on the leaves, that water eventually evaporates, but it does help to cool the plant off in the summertime. So plants can essentially sweat, but when that happens, it also releases water back up into the atmosphere. So we can put transpiration in there. So we have evaporation, transpiration. Water goes into the atmosphere as a gas. Eventually we have condensation as cloud formation. The water droplets get close enough together. We have precipitation. And that is a very quick water cycle.